Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's module on validity. Because validity is such an important concept in educational assessment, I think it's worth doing a video to really talk about this term and its relationship to something called reliability. You may notice that I didn't have you read the chapter in your textbook on reliability. And the reason for that is because I'm not sure it should demand a whole week of your time as a classroom teacher. It's something that comes into play a little bit more with big standardized tests, but it's worth knowing what it is because you'll deal with it on a certain level in your classroom. Validity, on the other hand, is something that you're going to deal with a lot, every day possibly. And so I wanted you to spend the bulk of your time on validity. But before we continue, I want to make sure that you understand the similarities and the relationships between these two words. First of all, some definitions. Validity. Validity is simply that an assessment measures what it intends to measure. If, for example, you want to measure students' reading comprehension, you are going to use a tool that is intended to see if they understand text. That easy. Reliability, on the other hand, is if an assessment measures what it's supposed to consistently. Let me give you an example to help you understand the difference. Say you got on the scale in the morning and it told you were 163 pounds. And you get off the scale and you got back on the scale and it said you were 140 pounds. You got off the scale and you got back on the scale and it said you were 120. In that case, you could say that your measuring tool is unreliable because it's not consistent. And we know that the term reliable means consistency over time. So, that's reliability, consistency. Think of it that way. Validity, on the other hand, is if you get on the bathroom scale and it measures what weight you actually are. If you get on the scale and it measures you at 102, every single time you get on the scale, it's definitely reliable. But if your weight is actually not 102 and it's actually measuring your IQ, it's not valid. It's not measuring what it's supposed to measure. In educational assessment, it works like this. Think about this problem. Say I devised an assessment in which I measured the circumference of your head and I correlated that with your intelligence. And I found that smaller heads, smaller intelligence. Bigger heads, bigger intelligence. Would that test be reliable? Well, if you said that the answer is yes, you're right. Because the circumference of your head is not going to change. That's going to stay the same over time. Now, is it valid? Is it measuring what it's intended to measure? Can the circumference of your head tell us how intelligent you are? No. So that particular measure would not be valid. So let's take a look at these both individually quickly, and then I'll wrap it up by sort of redefining so that you're really clear on what these two things are. Reliability comes in three forms, and it's worth knowing what they are. The first kind of reliability is stability reliability. Stability reliability means that things are going to be the same across time, like an IQ test. If I take the IQ test now and I take it in a year, my results are probably going to be the same. Why? Because the IQ test is one of the most reliable tests there are. Does it tell us anything valuable about a human being? Well, that's debatable. And that's a validity issue. But that's the first kind of reliability. The second kind of reliability I want to mention is alternative forms. This one you might use in your classrooms. That means that you have different forms of a test. Say you want to give second hour a different test than third hour, just in case one of those tests walks out of the room, or just in case kids talk about it between classes. If those two class periods do radically different, you might want to wonder if your measuring tool is off. It might be that your classes are just very different human beings, but if more kids are doing really lots better in one class than another one, it may be that you want to consider looking at your tool for reliability reasons. And the third kind of reliability that I want to mention is internal consistency. Internal consistency is the kind of reliability that you get, say if you're taking a personality test, and you notice that in 100 questions, you seem to have been asked the same one, maybe about optimism, maybe 3 or 4 or more times, only worded differently. That's what internal consistency is. It means that there's different kinds of questions on the same topic to see if you answer them the same way. If you don't, then the test might not be reliable. Now let's talk about validity for a minute. Validity also comes in 3 kinds. The first kind, and the kind that you're going to deal with the most, is called content validity. Content validity simply means that it measures, your assessment tool measures the objectives you set out to measure. So, if, for instance, I want to test students' understanding of, say, the Scarlet Letter, and I have them do a word search at the end of the novel, I'm really not going to get a very valid result because the tool doesn't have anything to do with what I hope to measure. The second kind of validity is construct validity, and this is one you probably will not use. Construct validity means that you're measuring a big construct or personality trait like self-efficacy or empathy or optimism. This one usually takes a pretty big data sample for it to be valid, but that's what construct validity is. The third kind of validity is criterion-based validity or predictive. Popham calls it criterion-based. But what it does is it tries to predict certain correlations between test A and test B, or test A and outcome B. For instance, the ACT test. The ACT is supposed to be not just a measure of students' readiness for college, but is also supposed to correlate to how many students finish their degree. Higher score on the ACT supposedly correlates with higher success finishing school. So it's predictive and correlative. Assessments can be, first off, reliable but not valid. Say you get really consistent results, but they don't measure what you intend to measure. That's a validity problem. Assessments can be reliable and valid, meaning that students are getting reliable results and they're nailing the kind of knowledge that you want them to. And finally, assessments can be unreliable and hence not valid. The reason for that is this: the two go together. If your scores are all over the place, then it may just be that your criterion is not well developed or defined, and so it's measuring a range of things. And so both things are still off. The last thing I want to leave with you is the definition of validity that you'll see later on in the class when we get to Understanding by Design with Wiggins and McTighe. And those authors suggest 2 questions that you ask yourself whenever you're designing an assessment. The first question is, could students do well on this and not have significant understanding? Well, sure. We give those kinds of assessments all the time. The second question is, could students do poorly on this and have significant understanding? And this is the question that we've all been faced with when we study really, really hard, say, for a test, and we do poorly on it because suddenly there's questions that you either didn't anticipate or didn't seem central to the instructor's goals. This happens a lot too in writing classes, where you turn in a paper, you work really hard on it, and it comes back and you've been graded on something that you didn't anticipate, something that's hard to measure, like authenticity. So, when you're thinking about the assessments you use for your classrooms, sort of put them through those 2 questions. Do they measure what you need to measure? That's only a question that you can answer. And do they feel reliable? Do they change depending on if students are having a good day or not? If, for example, if I gave you all an essay question and then I lost your essays and gave you the question again, would you have a similar result? That's reliability. So, as we're going through this module on validity this week, think about the relationship between your goals and the way that you see if students have mastered those goals as we talk some more about validity in the classroom.